You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love the stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely need to make starters these days. While originally based out of Portland, Oregon, imperial yeast has expanded to the East Coast, meaning even more people have access to their incredible lineup of yeast, including popular strains like A07 Flagship, A38 Juice, A09 Pub, and a Brewlosophy favorite, L17 Harvest. So good. Whether you brew at home or on the commercial scale, imperial yeast has what you need to make the best beer possible. You can check out all of their available strains and start your planning at imperialyeast.com. I think it's safe to say most brewers design their recipes to result in beer that meets certain target parameters. However, there are a number of factors that can limit exactly what a person can brew. Who hasn't wanted to brew an imperial stout or a quadruple IPA but avoided it because it would require making too many adjustments based on one's equipment? Another similar issue involves wanting to produce more than the standard 5 gallons or 19 liters of beer from a single batch when one's gear only allows for that volume. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and on this episode, I'm joined by contributor Andy Carter to chat about the unique method of first making a higher OG wort and then diluting it to increase final yield.
Yeah, I learned about this years ago when I think Tasty McDole brought it up on a random Brewing Network podcast where he said, if you want to make 10 gallons of like a lighter beer, just brew a high gravity beer and then dilute it. And he was using some kind of crazy stuff at the time, like just degassing water, putting it in kegs. I was like, this is so fascinating. And I really wanted to see if someone could tell a difference between worts that were diluted or not. And that's what the subject of this experiment is.
Yeah, this is one of those methods that I find really interesting, as I can see it opening up a lot of opportunities for people who brew on smaller setups like in apartments and such. I can't recall ever doing it to the full extent that we're going to be talking about today, but I have definitely diluted wort post-boil that was higher OG than I intended. And I've also went through this whole period where all of my yeast starters were made using a dilution method. We're going to be talking about all of that as well as the results of a very interesting experiment on the subject in this episode. All right, if you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our guest for August of 2022 is BrewTuber Stephen Heprick, better known as the Apartment Brewer. He probably knows a thing or two about dilution. Stephen regularly posts great videos on his YouTube channel that are both informational and very entertaining. Plus, as his channel name suggests, he has a ton of experience brewing on the smaller scale. So this session is going to be especially good for those of you who can't or don't want to brew standard size batches. To be a part of this session, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Friday, August 26, 2022, as Stephen's going to be taking questions that Saturday, the 27th. All past sessions with folks like Scott Janish, Sarah Flora, John Kimmich, and many more are stored on our private Facebook page as well as our Patreon feed, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by rating and reviewing it in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allows you to leave reviews, we really would appreciate it. For just a few seconds of your time, not only do you help make the show more visible to people who may not have heard of it yet, but you'll provide us with valuable feedback that we use to make the show better. Thank you to everybody who has already taken the time to let us know what you think. All right, feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120 volt system for 5-gallon batches, and local contributor Paul Amico just jumped into their 240 volt 10-gallon setup that he absolutely loves. He keeps bragging about how great it is. I've brewed on it with him about 4 times already, and it really is awesome. Clawhammer Supply puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they're intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not ready to make the jump to electric, they also have 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag home brewing starter kits. Whatever it is you're looking for, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. They're sure to have what it is you're looking for. All right, listener David Schell had some feedback on episode 243 where we shared our opinions on beer and brewing events. David said, I've been pouring at events for 15 years. It's my favorite thing we do as a club, and I have an incident I would like to share. Our club was pouring at a barbecue event that had a craft beer zone where the proceeds go to a local charity. That morning, there was a bicycle riding event where participants got free entrance to the craft beer zone. There was a gentleman whose bike outfit had a big leopard on it. We called him Leopard Leopard Boy. He was going to each booth pounding down samples. He comes to me and demands I give him the strongest beer, so I gave him a 2-ounce sample. He took the glass and sucked it into his stomach. There was no way he could have tasted it. He slammed the glass down and demanded another, so I gave him one. I can safely say this is the only festival goer that ever ticked me off. I informed the organizers of his behavior, and they told me they were aware of it. Soon after, he was being escorted out of the event, and that is the legend of Leopard Boy. Now, real quick, Andy, since you didn't co-host the episode David is referring to, one of the stories I told was about that drunk dude who tackled the poor T-Rex at the SoCal Fest a few years ago.
Yeah. So I help run a major homebrew event in Southern California Homebrewers Festival. And, this is going to happen when you have 1,000+ people outside and it's a sunny day. People are going to get drunk and behave inappropriately. And they might not mean to. I mean, this is the problem of this, right? You people do have a lack of foresight when they start having large amounts of alcohol. This guy did seem to want to get drunk, though, from the story. But things happen. And what's I think fascinating about this story is, or what's more fascinating about this story is, I don't know how many people were at this event. Maybe hundreds of people at this kind of smaller event. Maybe it was bigger, but our event, being 1,500 people plus. Honestly, it's so self-regulating. Maybe one or two people out of the crowd will have a problem that raises to the level that I need to be involved as a manager and not as someone else, because people take care of each other at my event. Homebrewing, as we know, we're on a podcast together. We've done this for a decade. It's a much more of a collaborative environment, and we do watch out for each other. And I think in general, homebrewers know when to stop drinking, much more so, in my opinion, much more so than the general population. So
I think you're being awfully generous to homebrewers there, Andy. You and I have been to so many events, various different events internationally. For me, I talked about that on that episode, and there are always a handful of people, where I'm looking and saying, "Damn, dude, you need to take a break, drink some water." But I'm down with people tying one on and having a good time. I don't have a moral issue with that. Go have fun, do what you want. Just be respectful of other people and don't act like an asshole. I mean, that really is the case. Now, here's the thing. I understand that there are some things people do that are kind of on the fence, right? And I tend to be pretty cool with like 99% of things. But when you're demanding more beer from somebody who is literally spending their day serving people and not just getting wasted with you, or you're hurting other people, like tackling a young lady who is in a T-Rex, costume, like that you have crossed the line. Just be cool, my babies. I mean, I honestly, just be cool. Go to these things. Watch yourself. If you're going to get slosh drunk, don't be a jerk about it. Just go sleep in a corner or something, and be cool with it.
And I think one thing that we've learned from running the event is that we encourage and actually now mandate people take responsible beverage training. That's through the state of California. And I would recommend anyone having these events to have people, even if it isn't official, where there's like a whole like process and a certificate. You can find a local sheriff or police department that'll give you this training. They'll show up and they'll provide this training. They may charge it, they may not. But it's good because you have to empower the servers to say no. They really do. And then just say, look, if you feel as a server, if you ever felt compromised, like, oh, this person's being very, very religious, find the organizer and say, look, I don't want to serve this person anymore, or just recommend they have water, or at your booth, here's a non-alcoholic beer, or just honestly, I don't like lying to people, but literally just serve them a non-alcoholic beer and let them walk away at that point, right? So
I have zero qualms with that. Somebody, and hey, you know what? I'll give you a free one. Here's a free pint of beer.
One.
Yeah. Honestly, you serve somebody who's that sloshed a glass of water, chances are they're not going to complain for too long.
Exactly.
Anyways, so
exactly.
I couldn't agree more. Get some training and don't be afraid to be assertive with these people.
Exactly.
Tell them to stop. I was at I don't mean to keep carrying this on, but I was at an event. It must have been 2 or 3 years ago now. Local, I think it was a brewery anniversary party, and we'd been there for a good 3 or 4 hours. Everyone was rocking a nice buzz, and this one guy just kept going back, and he was like, everyone was like, how is this guy coming and refilling these big old pints, Belgian tulip glasses so often? And finally the bar manager was like, hey, you're done, brother. You can hang out. You're not being a jerk, but you're not drinking anymore either. He was slurring his speech and doing all of that. Don't be afraid to do that. You got to take care of people. So, all right. Thank you for the feedback, David. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. If you haven't already, just another reminder, go follow us on YouTube. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised in a couple of months. When we're back from this break, our focus will be on the impact of diluting high OG wort to make a lower strength pale lager. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort, from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature, in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. My first homebrewing kit was intended to produce 5-gallon or 19-liter batches using extract with steeping grains. It came with a 4-gallon kettle that allowed me to boil a little over 3 gallons of wort, which I would then dilute with good water to reach my target volume of 5 gallons. Now, I've been brewing all grain methods for over a decade now, but I've often wondered why dilution is so commonplace for extract brewers, though rarely gets talked about among all grain brewers.
You know, it's funny because I think a lot of people start with extract, and they either see the people are saying, "Oh my God, my beer is so much better when it's using all grain," and I think that's true for a lot of styles. I don't think you can replicate the same thing with extract, but that concentration process, the opposite of what we're talking about today, if that's impacting your flavor, not necessarily negatively, that is the place to look. And now I like dilution because it's kind of another thing to try, right? We had mentioned at the top of the show, like this is a whole nother avenue to look at in terms of experiments. And why I like it is that anyone could do this. This is not a process issue where you need to buy something expensive or have specialized equipment. You could do this anything. You just need you may need extra sanitized or very clean vessels to hold wort in. But then I think there's a lot of openings here for this kind of making new lighter styles of beer.
Absolutely. And just to be very clear, when we say dilution, what we're talking about in general is making concentrated wort, which any extract brewer is very familiar with. You make a concentrated wort, meaning it has a higher specific gravity than what you're intending to pitch the yeast into. And then you dilute it down and reducing that OG with water. And we're going to talk a little bit about methods for doing that in a minute. But it's a very simple concept that can be applied in multiple situations, actually. It doesn't just have to be used for making bigger batches, though I think dilution will always create higher yield, right? That's probably the number one reason people want to do that. Is it's a great way to increase your yield. You can get 2 whole keg fulls out of a single batch of beer, and you can do some fun messing around and experimenting with different ingredients and such. So you can actually make, I guess, ostensibly 2 different types of beer, whether that's you're fermenting with different yeasts, you're maybe dry hopping one, or you're adding adjuncts to one after the fact. There's all kinds of neat stuff that utilizing this method of dilution can really increase what a brewer can do with their brewing.
Yeah, and I think one thing is we talk about efficiency. A lot of people go into mash efficiency or brewhouse efficiency. I think there's another efficiency here, which is time efficiency.
That's right.
I got a party. I want to make 10 gallons of beer for it, not 5. I only have a 5-gallon system or smaller. Dilution allows you to say, hey, I can speed this process up as long as you have the fermentation space, granted. But if you have a 10-gallon tank, and this happens all the time in professional brewing, they don't have a brew house that's one size and then fermenter tanks that's one size. They have a brew house that's one size and fermenter tanks that are usually 3 to 4 times as big, so they can run multiple batches into it, or like we're talking about today, dilute one batch and fill it much faster.
Yeah, and there are, people have probably heard the party guile method, which is not a dilution method, but it is kind of I would consider it kind of on the line that stretches out to what ultimately is dilution with water. You're basically taking a single mash and making multiple beers out of that mash. Well, with dilution, you're taking a single batch and you can ultimately make different beers out of it. And I think that is one of the coolest things about it. Also, if you're brewing in an apartment and you don't have the space for a full 5-gallon, even a full 5-gallon brew in a bag system requires a pretty big kettle if you want to mash in it, pull those grains out and boil. Well, if you're cool with diluting and it doesn't have a negative impact on the beer you're making, you can use a 4-gallon kettle and get a 5-gallon batch out of that, or even a couple of 3-gallon batches. I mean, it's really neat what you can get away with if you are comfortable with diluting. And again, to point out, if the dilution doesn't actually result in have a negative impact on the quality of the beer. I think when it comes to diluting, though, there are certain things you have to think about in terms of recipe design, right, Andy? I've never designed a recipe for dilution, and I say that up front because I have very little experience with this method. But when you're designing a recipe, what are things you have to do to ensure that you're going to get your expectations met?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is, like we say for a lot of reasons on this show and a lot of reasons in homebrewing, is you really know your system well. I wouldn't start doing this the first time, because what you do need to understand is your mash efficiency, your boil off efficiency. You need to have all these numbers kind of understood, at least some, relative specs, right? It's never going to be perfect. There's going to be error bars. And unless you're people like us that brew all the time and take really good notes and have statistics, right? You're going to need a few batches to understand that. So the first thing is mash efficiency. If it's a small, it's like, now brewing a bag is a little different because there's a much more consistent over OG efficiency to that system. But just making sure that, hey, when I brew a 1040 beer, or I target 1040, or when I target 1080 in my OG, how do I get there, and how much grain do I need to adjust by to make that work? That's one problem. The second thing you need to worry about is boil off efficiency. So I know in general those are the same. So, but I notice a little bit of difference depending on volume. That's really due to how rolling the boil is, how big the boil is. Now the boil off rate is really determined by the pot diameter, but I do notice that if there's not as much liquid in my Brewzilla systems, that the boil is harder and that's rolling more. So there's it's a bit faster. At least it seems that way to me.
That makes perfect sense to me. And I've witnessed the same thing even on my 240 volt system. That smaller volumes, I tend to get a little bit more boil off. And I think it's just because it has nothing to do necessarily with the volume, but the fact that you are getting a harder boil, if you're using the same heat, right? So.
Yes, exactly. Same amount of watts going in translates into just a more. It's just going to spend more time at like 212 Fahrenheit,
right,
or 100 degrees Celsius. So then the next thing would be hopping. I think this is where other than mash efficiency, I think hopping is a big deal, because hopping, how efficient alpha acids go in, or the perception of alpha acids go into wort, does determine by OG. So especially like for this recipe, we'll see the calculations I did that make it so that we're trying to target the same IBU at the end of the date, which matters.
That would matter a lot to me, because
I think that's the top one.
Yeah, there are brewers out there, and I really envy the people who brew and they just throw things together, and whatever beer comes out in the end, they're just proud they made it, they like it, it's all good, and then the next time they brew, they don't really consider what they did in the past. I am not that kind of a brewer. I am absolutely anal about the things that I do, and I love consistency. I love when my numbers are spot on. So I'm that dude who, like, every time I got a new system, I would run through 2 or 3 batches and make sure every single number was exactly right. Meanwhile, I'm also the short and shoddy guy, which is kind of funny because that's, but one of the things that I've learned is that when I'm making a high OG beer, so the 5-gallon batch, not diluted or whatever, if I am mashing a high OG beer, say something upwards of 1080 or so, 1080 OG, I get lower efficiency, lower conversion, it seems. And so that would be something, like you said, know knowing your system, knowing what happens typically should allow you to better predict a final outcome if you are going to end up diluting that wort. At least that's what it seems like to me, is that no, if you know that well enough, then if you dilute it, you should be closer to that expectation than if you didn't know your system very well, at least.
Yeah, you have to be able to have that. And I think especially, so you can do this at home and you'll have the fun. And one thing we keep saying, is it negative or is there a change in the beer? One thing is I kind of have the rules of the road for brewing, and one of them is sanitization. Another one is, I think yeast pitch rate, yeast temperature and stuff like that. So really, if you're following the kind of basic tenets that we espouse on the website and on the podcast, you're not going to make a bad beer. You're going to make a beer you might not like. And so the dilution and looking into a dilution is like, what are we pushing here and what you want, right? Because I think sometimes people, and rightly so, because their palates are their palates, is that, oh, this beer feels too heavy to me, I want it lighter. And this is one way to actually lighten a beer up very quickly without a lot of funky, enzyme additions or yeast choice and stuff like that. So it really is a neat approach. And I think the simple perspective and the kind of the simple idea that I had, question that I asked is okay, so if I just cut out 50% of my starting water volume and I make the beer with 50% of the water go all the way through, and then I add that back. That's not necessarily how it works. You've got to make other calculations. Now, thankfully for us who don't want to calculate stuff in Excel or, pen and paper, most brewing calculators, we use Brewfather here at Brewlosophy. Most brewing calculators do have a dilution function, which makes it very, very easy. That being said, you still have to know your system and plug in all of the proper numbers and such so that your efficiencies are spot on, or at least that you get close to that goal. So one of the other questions that I had about dilution is, obviously I think the answer to this is going to be yes, but it seems to me that it would be beneficial, at least, some of the time, if you use some of these enzymes that are coming out in the mash to ensure that you're getting the most conversion you possibly can out of this high OG mash. Yeah, that would make sense. I mean, you want to be able to not only be precise, be consistent in when you do each batch, but if you want to maximize the value of the wort, or just using a little more grain. We also talk about that too, right? Just another handful of grain. I think in this calculation, we used a little bit extra grain just to make sure we're going to hit the numbers dead on.
Yeah, exactly. And you're making a high OG wort. So you got to kind of, up until you dilute it, you got to kind of treat it like you're just making a big old beer. That's the way I think about it, at least.
Yes. Exactly.
And I know for me, when I'm making a big beer, I do things a little bit differently than when I'm making a normal strength beer, or that's what I refer to it as. If I'm making a pale lager, or if I'm making a pale ale versus a double IPA or a imperial stout, I'm doing things a little bit differently to ensure that I get the most out of that. Or I'm thinking about things differently. For example, if I know I get less mash efficiency when I'm making an imperial stout, then I'm going to bump up the grains that I use. You may have to do that if you're doing a dilution thing as well. So one of the costs associated with this dilution method could be that you're spending a little bit more money on grain to ensure that you get those that starting OG properly. So what are some of the considerations we need to think about when diluting wort? The first thing that comes to my mind is you have to use good water. I mean, we are water freaks here at Brewlosophy, and if you're going to dilute wort, you're not going to go and pull your dilution water from a green water hose on the side of your house. You want to use water that is at least as good as the stuff that you're brewing with in the first place. Yeah,
and that's paramount, I think, here, especially since the water you're adding is going to be less treated, right? You're not going to have the same hops in there. You're not going to say malt, right? It is just water, right?
Yeah.
So this experiment, we picked pre-fermentation dilution. There's obviously avenues for post-fermentation dilution. We just said in this one, the risk and the more practical way that I think most people would be doing it is this way. Now, if you consider post, that's when water becomes, like, I would say, the scariest part of this whole process, because it is so... It's raw. It's like literally raw, unless you boil the water, put it in the one way I thought about doing it would be to boil the water, throw it in a corny and let it chill in the corny until it's room temp, right? And then do it, or cold. But then you have to also get rid of the oxygen, right? It's not necessarily deoxygenated, and that's a complicated process. I have thought about ways to do that too. So there's all these other issues that you have because you're just like running so many risks when you add that. But water is a huge thing. And then the water chemistry, in this recipe, we did, add minerals back and this kind of thing. So,
yeah, well, and I don't know if oxygenation would be much of a concern if you correct me if I'm wrong, Andy. If you're diluting pre-fermentation, I don't think it's much of a concern there. But I have heard somebody, I believe it was Drew Beecham, was telling me a story one time about, and maybe I'm thinking of somebody else, but how they kegged up a batch and everybody was just saying how it was so strong and the malt flavor was too strong. Not necessarily that it was high in alcohol, but that the malt flavors were really strong. And this person, I think it was Drew, added back some RO water. And in that, I didn't even consider the fact of the oxygen that's present in that water, potentially, resulting in oxidation in that beer. That is definitely something that I would want to consider if I'm doing it that way.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. No, you want to be very, like anytime it's post-fermentation, you run a lot more risks. So you want to be very careful.
Yeah. Another thing you already mentioned, hopping and making sure that, that you measure out the way that you're going to do your hopping if you're going to do this dilution thing. I think the big thing with that is bitterness. There's a lot of talk about how higher OG worts, the isomerization of alpha acids in higher OG worts is just different. I've messed around with that a little bit and I've not experienced, maybe it's just a perception thing and I'm not sensitive to it. I've not experienced much of a difference. Now, we've also done a lot of lab measurements of IBU and good luck trying to figure that stuff out because the calculators that we're using to determine what I'll put in air quotes, bitterness units, they're just not accurate compared to like actual, lab measurements. They're all over the place. So I'm not really sure how to go about thinking about the bitterness thing. I'd probably just hop it the same and cross my fingers, but
I wanted to have at least a paper trail. Like anytime we do these experiments, you want to have the reasoning, right? I could explain to you what I'm going to do, but if I can't back it up with some type of calculation, like why did I choose? It's like be upfront, right? This is a controlled experiment, right? Be upfront. So I want to be like as close as possible, even if it's a small factor. I want to be as close as possible. So the first factor here is it's a lower alcohol beer. It's a lighter beer. So we wanted to know the numbers more, right? If it was more like 30, 40 IBUs and being off a little bit, that's one story.
Yeah.
I think in my opinion, why there's a lot of talk about why it matters is not so much the homebrew side where there's much less analytical data available.
Sure.
It's at the big beer side where first IBUs are invented for them. They weren't invented for homebrewers, right? That's one thing. The second thing is for those that don't know, when you scale up to very big batch sizes, the barrels of beer and stuff, things are so much more efficient. The extraction rates are so much more efficient. I think what you see there is that if you're at like Stone Brewing Company, which is, Mitch Steele was the guy that talked about this in some of his books, and other people have talked about this, is like when you go from 30 IBUs to 100 IBUs or OGs of like 1040 to 1080 on a big system, I think you see the fall off much more quickly.
Sure.
I think that's where the measurement comes from, is that they're not getting 100% efficiency in the IBUs, they're getting like 80, which means the beer will not taste the same. I think that's where it comes from, because for us, we are so inefficient about extracting things because of the small size and the equipment available, is that we don't measure the impact because it's in the noise for us versus them.
Hobby versus profession. And the truth of the matter is commercial brewers need consistency because that's what consumers expect, right?
That's dollars. That's dollars and cents.
Dollars and cents, man. That's exactly what it is. So I think though on the homebrew scale, I know that there are commercial brewers out here, out there who listen to this show as well. You obviously have a different way of doing this. And I don't know how common dilution is on the commercial scale anyways.
I can comment to that actually. It is there in the professional scale. It's mostly to adjust OGs. When you're going in, you're doing multiple turns of a system.
Sure.
You're just going to tweak the water a little bit. Now it's like a 5 or 10% issue, not a 50% issue that we're kind of discussing today. So it does happen.
Exactly. And that's what I hear most often is that the dilution is with RO water that's been mineralized to the same, level, but it's usually as an OG adjustment for that consistency, right? So that you can ensure that beer hits whatever the ABC is expecting the ABV to be, ABV to be that beer and all that stuff. But I don't know if they're doing what we're going to be, the experiment we're going to be talking about today that is very accessible to homebrewers for sure. Another thing that you have to consider if you're going to be diluting your wort is making sure that you add the proper amount of dilution water to hit the numbers that you want. And that may mean that you're taking, a couple of extra measurements. Using a refractometer makes it very, very easy because you can add portions of water until you hit the OG that you're looking for. That's the way I've done it in the past. Again, I'm not diluting with 50% or anything like that, but that's the way I've done it. And I know there are people out there who loathe refractometers. I absolutely love my refractometer. They're not hard to use. I don't understand why people complain about using them. They're so easy. But yeah, that's the way that I do it. So, a few extra measurements, but it's nothing. I don't think it's nothing that too much in the way.
I think it's just paperwork, right? You just have to, if you make your plan ahead of time and then just make a spreadsheet. If you get worked up about it, and sometimes I do, it's like, all right, what do I want to do? Make the boxes and then fill them out. Just make them linear, fill them out along the way, and then you have the data. You're not going to miss anything. But yeah, I agree with refractometers. I mean, I use a manual one. I know people have the electric ones. There's also today you can go out and buy for a few $100s. I know that's a lot of money. I get it. That's a lot of money for many people, but for a few $100s, you can have almost a professional density meter that you can do on the fly density measurements, right? So there's less and less barrier to do the measurement, and I would hate to be the guy that has a hydrometer doing this, because it's just to be a mess, right? It'd be a lot of waste. I hate that. So that's where I go immediately to refractometer. And it's just about how to use the refractometer, just understanding it and feeling comfortable with it. It's not a perfect measurement system, but it is something. And then for volume, if this is the whole point of this experiment is measuring volume, and that's when knowing your system really counts in terms of boil off rates. Those graduation markers, you get your Bruzilla, you unfurl this shiny new claw hammer or Bruzilla system, and you want to go, hey, I measured out 5 gallons of water. I weighed it, so I know it's exactly 5 gallons of water. And then you put it in your system. It might not line up. Those numbers might be a little off. So you have to understand that about your system too. The markers inside of a kettle might not be exactly right. Those are manufactured. They're not measured. So just pay attention to that.
Yeah. They're really close guesses. We'll put it that way.
Yes. Yes.
I've now, to be fair, the claw hammer that Paul and I set up about 4 weeks ago, we measured the volumes and they were spot on. So sometimes they are spot on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've definitely had kettles that were not. We're talking almost full gallons off. It's a pain in the butt. You brew your first 2 batches and then you get it in the keg and you're like, why am I a gallon short? Well, the volumes in the kettle were off, so you got to figure that stuff out. But also you need to know the amounts, the volumes of water that you're going to be adding and what that's going to do. It's kind of this marriage between volume and specific gravity and where you want to be with both of those. It's just considering that stuff when you do it. Nothing too difficult. Again, a lot of the brewing calculators out there have this function, and so you can use that and then tweak your equipment profiles to ensure that you're landing where you want to land. Now, there are other points of dilution. We've talked a little bit about one of them already, which is if you overshoot your OG, which all of us have done at least one time. I was making a Schwartz beer one time, and I don't know what happened, but I was like 10 points over where I needed to be at the end of the boil. I don't know if I probably added like 2 pounds extra grain or something, and I just didn't realize it. But I was 10 points over. I knew I did not want this Imperial Schwartz beer. So I figured, you know what? I'm just going to dilute the wort post boil, cross my fingers and see what happens. It ended up actually scoring like a 42 in a competition.
Yeah,
so,
nice.
so to me, now albeit I only added like a gallon and a half of water. It wasn't much. It wasn't, and I think that was a 10 gallon batch, back when I was brewing larger batch sizes. But hey, that kind of showed me that beer was delicious. It did really well in competition. That diluting doesn't necessarily mean you're going to ruin your beer. And I know there's a lot of people out there who view things like dilution as cheating or as kind of this way out. But it's not necessarily a bad thing, at least for the people that I know who have done it the way that I have. I'm sure you've diluted higher OG worts, or do you just go with a higher ABV in the end?
In general, I think I've just gone with it. I've definitely diluted. The only time I can distinctly remember diluting wort is when I was doing extract, because I had to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm trying to think of a time I did, and it really is only this was prompted me because I wanted to do it not in a I'll just add a gallon and see what happens. But I was like, I need to really understand this, and I really wanted to be precise.
Yeah.
So this is the really the if I've done it, it was just because oh shit, I'm off by a half gallon. That kind of.
Exactly. We've all been there as well.
Yeah.
Another thing I mentioned it earlier is with yeast starters. Now, if you are like me and you take the risk of boiling your starters in the Erlenmeyer flask, which I have a ceramic cooktop, and so I'm not putting it on a coil. It's just the ceramic. So it's almost like what people do to make it safe. They put like a trivet down on the thing, so you're not actually. That's basically what a ceramic cooktop does anyway. So it's always, I've never cracked an Erlenmeyer flask in hundreds of starters that I've made. But one of the big things is the geyser that can occur as the boil is being reached in an Erlenmeyer flask, which, it goes up in a cone, and it's absolute mess. It's scary. It's hot. It hurts. So one thing I started doing years and years ago is I would make a higher strength wort, so about 1080. I would just cut out about 50% of the water that the yeast starter calculator called for. And I usually would make larger starters anyways. So I do half that. It made boiling it really easy. Never had a boil over. And then when I got done, I would add in the additional water I needed to get me to the proper volume, and it would be ice cold water, so I didn't have to chill the wort either. It was kind of a win-win, if you ask me. And it never had an issue. Those starters worked perfectly fine. I harvested yeast from them, reused that yeast. There was no issues with them. Again, total bonus. No need to chill.
No, that's a very slick way of doing it. I like that a lot.
Well, check this out. This doesn't have to do with diluting, all grain wort. But back when I first started brewing, I hated the chilling process. I think a lot of people, it's like, oh, come on, how can we make this more efficient, right? It's why we use jaded chillers, because they're so fast. Well, back when I was doing extract with steeping grains, I had the idea, hey, I've got this 3 gallons of wort. I need 2 more gallons basically to get me to that 5-gallon thing. Why don't I just pour this hot wort over a bag of ice? So I would pour what amounted to about 2 gallons of water in ice form into my fermentation bucket, and then slowly pour that wort over that. Yeah. And it worked beautifully. And some dude at the homebrew shop was like, oh no, you're going to shock your wort and it's going to make it taste better. Like, who made that crap up? It worked perfectly fine. Never an issue. So again, there are other bonuses to diluting. One of them is that you can significantly reduce the chilling time.
And what's good about ice, if you especially go from the store and buy some good ice, is that is considered food. So it's actually quite clean. Yeah. In the sense of it, I don't know about sterile or sanitization wise, but you are pouring a hot liquid into a cold liquid. So there is some, like you're boiling quickly, getting something hot, right? So I'm less concerned about it. So it's like it's clean, and then especially you're going to pitch yeast much more quickly than you would otherwise, right? Because it's already at pitching temperature. So I like that a lot. I like the idea. And I think it's sound from a microbiological perspective. Yeah. More or less.
Yeah, I think so too. Now, there are some purported downsides of dilution. We've already talked about a few. I think the obvious one that we hear the most often, or at least that I heard the most often, is that, it's going to give your beer a watered down flavor. I've not experienced that. What about you, Andy?
I don't think so. And I think that was like one thing going in, like, is there going to be a general like significance to the experiment because it tastes different from that perspective? But I don't think watered down is I think that's a feature. I don't think that's a bug. I think sometimes if you want a beer to have a little bit more of a lawnmower beer, easy drinking quality, maybe this is something that, if it is true, right? If this came back significant and we polled people and said why, and they taste watered down, that could be that's a tool in your toolkit, not necessarily a negative. So.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Another one that we mentioned earlier is potential lack of bitterness. I know one concern that a lot of people have with adding unboiled water, which I guess you could pre-boil your water if you wanted to, is, the potential for contamination. But all of these things are why we do the experiments that we do. Now, I've not diluted a full batch, like I said earlier, to essentially double my volume. My experience diluting yeast starters and wort with higher OG than expected has always been positive, though. And, I do have a friend who once doubled a batch using the dilution method. The way he served it to me was, hey, here's basically a German Helles export beer, and then here's like a table Pilsner. And I didn't know at the start that they were started from the same wort. And all he did is he split a batch of wort and then added water to one of them to get that OG down. And I'm telling you, it was delicious. Both of the beers, they tasted different, but they were awesome. Andy, you were curious how a standard OG batch compares to a batch where higher OG wort was diluted. So you put it to the test. We're going to be getting to those results when we're back from this break. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. There are a bunch of things in brewing that seem to have gotten a bad rap based largely on conjecture. Andy, you and I have been around long enough to know exactly the things that we're talking about. And one of those things, at least in my opinion, is relying on dilution when making beer. I mean, this was talked so poorly about when I got into brewing over 20 years ago. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the beers that I've had that were made this way seemed perfectly fine to me, but you, Andy, wanted to actually test it out for yourself.
Yeah, so I wanted to understand dilution, not just from there's a objective perspective. We talk about objective measurements all the time, OG, FG, color, all these other things of measuring things objectively that have absolutely no bearing on the final beer in terms of the tests we make. So what does this mean subjectively when you dilute Wort? So I started with 2 5-gallon batches of simple pale lager, very simple grist, very simple hopping. It was 100% Pilsner malt. And for the brewing process, I mashed both batches in at 153 Fahrenheit or 67 degrees Celsius for 60 minutes. When the mash was complete, I batch sparged one to reach target boil volume, while the other batch was sparged with just 0.6 gallons or 2.25 liters. This led to a pre-boil volume difference of 3.4 gallons or 11.7 liters.
Fascinating. That is so. And this is. I'm glad you did batch sparge on this one, because then it wouldn't be argued. For this experiment at the very least, when you're brewing on your own and you're doing dilution, you can do it however the hell you want to. But for this, the argument could be that your mash volume differences are what contributed to the difference in these beers, if there is one. In this one, you really were clean with that, and you sparged with different volumes of water. Yeah.
So I chose to batch sparge because that's how I do almost virtually all my beer, unless it's a special experiment with fly sparging or some other type of single infusion type system. So I know my system very well when I batch sparge. That's why I picked batch sparging for this recipe.
I love it.
So boiled for 60 minutes, and like we mentioned, we want to check on the bitterness, right? So we know that there's going to be some effect due to the changes in volume, changes in OG. So for this batch, I calculated using the Tinseth formula that the normal batch needed 32 grams of hops, and this in case was Liberty hops, versus 42 grams for the batch we eventually dilute.
So that's a 10-gram difference, which you're looking at less than half of an ounce. Now, I think there's an argument to be made for, well, let's see what happens if you hop them exactly the same. But again, we were in this. I think the overwhelming opinion is that higher OG worts are going to isomerization is going to happen differently in those higher OG worts. Mm-hmm. So making the decision to use what we have available to us, which is the Tinseth, Rager, or Garrett's formulas in terms of IBU. Using the one that we've all settled on, which is Tinseth, to determine what if those bitterness levels are going to be the same. I think that was a smart move for this initial iteration of this experiment. So good call.
So when both boils were complete, I needed to get to kind of in terms of sanitization, everything like that. Right before I added water, and I wanted to dilute right before finished boiling, so I would sanitize the water going in, just to make sure there'd be no extra microbiomes or anything like that. So sure. I took a refractometer reading of the higher OG Wort, and it was 1058. At that moment, I added 2.3 gallons or 8.7 liters of just RO water to the concentrated Wort to reach the same final volume right before knocking out.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, that's cool.
At that point, that was basically a way of you can replicate this recipe, replicate this experiment at your own system, so it's very consistent, right, to manage all those little tenets that I talked about. So at that point, pumping into the Delta fermentation tanks, I would measure OG, and the diluted one was at 1044 versus the standard one at 1045.
So I would say that you nailed it then. I mean, you do know the systems well. You've been brewing on the Brewzillas for almost 2 years now, I think. A ton of beer. That to be just one specific gravity point off, I would say that's pretty close to the same thing. So you nailed it there. Yeah. At this point, one could argue these worts are basically the same. Same amount of grains were used. Same amount of water at this point was used. One of them just has fresh water added to it, while the other one was mashed full volume.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So like that's kind of the cool thing of like these experiments. It's like, hey, we got not only we know objectively we did something different, right? But also objectively we got to the same numbers. So that's right. It's good. It's a good refreshing thing to measure. So once the worts were pumped into the fermentation tanks, I let them chill to 60 Fahrenheit or 16 C, at which both received 1 pouch of Imperial Yeast L17 or the harvest strain.
My favorite. Love that yeast.
10 days later, the temp was raised up to 70 Fahrenheit or 21 C. So they sat for another 10 days or so before I took a hydrometer reading just to see where we were at with the 2 batches. The diluted batch finished at 1.007 FG, where the standard batch finished at 1.10 FG.
So this is an objective, observable difference that we are seeing with our own eyes right off the bat, even before sensory analysis. And to me, it's very interesting. Now, again, the diluted batch started at 1044 OG. Standard batch was at 1045. So you got a 1 point SG difference there. Now, they finished at 1007 and 1010, respectively, which results in an ABV difference of, ABVs of 4.9% for the diluted batch and 4.6% for the standard batch. Nobody's going to taste a difference of 0.3%. If you say that you can, I don't believe you ever. But it is an interesting thing to note that for whatever reason, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, Andy, for whatever reason, that diluted batch had a higher attenuation, 84% apparent attenuation versus the 78% from the standard batch. What might explain that? Because water is not fermentable on its own. What makes that difference?
Well, I think the difference comes in the worts. The worts, the full batch was imagine the liquid was exposed to the complete mash, right? So it's pulling in all the minerals, all the bits and pieces, especially the long chain sugars from the grains, versus the other batch. It has the same density, right? So the same kind of makeup, not density. It's like, imagine a pie chart. It's got fermentable sugars, unfermentable sugars, proteins, all that stuff. What you imagine is take that pie chart and immediately you've removed 40% of it, right? And it makes sense if you look at this numbers, 007 versus 010, we're different by about 40%, 40% in the numbers, which tracks with the dilution we did.
Yeah, that's how I think of it as well. Is that the act of thinning that wort out also, you're not extracting as much of the stuff as you would from a full volume mash, and so those maltodextrins, the less fermentable long chain sugars, all of that stuff, you are just thinning out whatever you got in that diluted wort, or I guess the concentrated wort when you dilute it, and that can lead to higher attenuation. And I think this supports that notion, which I have heard discussed before in the past, that if you're going to use this dilution process, you might want to mash a little bit higher so that when you dilute it, you're getting that expected attenuation. Just something to keep in mind. A very interesting finding, in my opinion.
Yeah. So at this point, the beers are pressure transferred to CO2 purge kegs, so completely clean kegs. They're placed on gas in my keezer in a condition for about 3 weeks before I serve them to participants.
Now, I have a question for you, Andy. We always do this. Whenever we keg these beers, the experiment beers, of course, we want to drink our beer as well. So we start sampling them within a couple of days of kegging it. Yeah. Was there at any point, because I'm looking at the picture of these beers and they look identical. I would have expected this. I don't know why I would expect this, but I would have expected the diluted batch to be paler in the end. Yeah. But I'm looking at the picture of these beers and they look, the foam is the same color. They look like they got the same foam quality. The color looks the same to me. Was there a point where you're looking at them with your own eyes in real life thinking, okay, one does look different than the other one?
I thought about that a little bit, being so biased. I thought maybe, this does look lighter or not. And unfortunately, our phones can, because most of the pictures we take are with phones. They're not with high professional cameras.
Sure. Giving our secrets away, man.
Oh, sorry. So bleep that out. That it's hard for the camera to register the slight changes.
Absolutely.
But it's possible, and so I think there's maybe to my eye a little bit, but not significant. So
not like if you served me a pint of one and then I finished that and you served me a pint of the other, chances are I'm going to think they were the same beer. That's how similar they look to me.
Yeah. So, personal impressions. So, I think they look the same. So, we do our own internal blind, semi-blind triangle tests, and I was only right 3 out of 5 times. So, I did feel like I was tasting differences, but honestly, I think it was just guessing. So,
3 out of 5 people are gonna hear that and they're gonna think, well, that's pretty consistent. Everything that is different with these beers. You are serving the triangles to yourself, and even with all of that in your favor, you still missed it twice. And to me, that speaks volumes. Obviously, that's not what matters here. People have begged us to share our opinions because for some reason, some people value that more than blind participant data, but we do not. And that is why we serve these to blind participants.
Yeah. So then we served them to traditional xBmt analysis. We got 23 people to chase these beers blind, and to meet our standards of significance, we would need 12. And in this case, I only received 6 people, or 26% confidence. So this came back not significant.
So, and this is very interesting. If you are serving a triangle test to somebody of the same exact beers, so you got 3 of the identical beers in those cups, you would expect by random chance alone for about 33% of people to pick each color, or each sample, I should say. We use colored cups. But you would expect 33%. Not even that was able to identify the unique sample in this series of triangle tests, which we can say with some level of confidence. We are not saying that dilution creates the same exact as not diluting beer. What we are saying is that in this specific experiment, it seems to suggest that dilution did not have much of a perceptible impact on the characteristics of these beers. And I think that is absolutely fascinating that somebody can brew a high OG wort, split it, make 10 gallons out of a 5-gallon batch, and come out the end with just as good a quality as as if they didn't dilute it. That is amazing to me.
Yeah, and this is just like to me, the data is so fascinating for this one because of all the things we did. I think I said at the time, this is one of the more complicated experiments I've taken on because of all the numbers, all the measurements, all the changes. And you think to yourself, even when I tasted the beers, like you said earlier, what do you think the beers when they're first time? I'm like, oh man, I could definitely tell a difference. Honestly, then you come back and there isn't. So it's like, wow, how big of an impact this is. And honestly, then it gives you the confidence, right? If this came back significant, you'd be like, oh, okay, I got to really, maybe you might worry too much about diluting now, right? You would put too much faith into it. But to see a not significant result come back, it just makes me encouraged to try it more and be less afraid of ever trying this, especially where beers could be much more complicated. Like imagine IPA, right? You started with double IPA strength wort and then to dilute it back. I mean, what would happen then to make a pale ale? That'd be so interesting.
So interesting. And that's another point that I want to talk about is the fact that this was a pale lager with 100% Pilsner malt, and yet people still couldn't taste it. I mean, that is like the easiest beer to not hide stuff behind, to perceive off flavors in. I would think, if you're adding water, you added 8.7 liters or something like that. What was the total amount of volume of water you added?
The total amount of water was 2.3 gallons or 8.7 liters of change.
And you would think water, people say water doesn't have a flavor, but if you compare different waters, they taste different. I would think, in a 100% Pilsner malt beer that you took from 1058 down to 1044, which is crazy in and of itself, that you might be able to taste a difference. I fully expected this one to come back significant. And yet out of 23 people, only 6 people happened to guess, the odd beer out. That's just so cool. I mean, what are some of the implications of this that you can think of? What kind of stuff might people be able to do if they're open, to diluting their wort?
To me, the big thing is the how fast you can make beer. I mean, especially if you already know you could do 10 or 15 gallons at a time. If you have a Keyser and a couple tanks or a couple carboys, that's one. You already mentioned, I think the better one for a lot of people is not necessarily brewing the same batch identical, is to make 2 different beers quickly. Like you can see, and it's really easy on the BJCP, if you especially have the apps, or even really Brewfather is probably a better way to look at this, is just go look and say wow, these 2 beer styles, they're radically different, yet their worts are almost the same, right? Yep. There's a ton of overlap, and say, boom, go here, boom, go here. Maybe the hops are different, yeast is different, but boom, you have 2 different worts. So that's another thing to try. And that especially that goes into the 2 different tanks, right? Hey, I got a Saison over here. Maybe that's room temperature fermentation. And then I got a lager over here, same wort. And then one would hope those 2 beers are different because those are 2 different styles. But, your mileage may vary. And it just makes me not, I would be. So the thing was again, is it negative or is it just different?
Yeah.
And that's where it's hey, I don't feel so bad if like, oh man, I really missed this. I really screwed up this mash, or my boils are all off, or man, I forgot a gallon of wort. Well, add the water back. I don't think it's going to make a bad beer. I think it's going to make a different beer. But even with looking at this first cut of statistics, maybe there won't be a difference. So.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is you went the nth degree. I mean, you went big time, added a large volume of water. To me, what the first thing that I think of with this result is, I'm not going to accept it as holy gospel at this point. But man, if I overshoot my OG and I need to add back a quarter gallon of water to get it back down to where I want it, I am not going to be worried about it. Now, we got a bunch of reader comments on this one. I think naturally a lot of people found this finding quite curious. And a lot of them have to do with things like contamination and such. The first bit of feedback comes from somebody who calls himself metric ton, TUN, which I think is kind of funny. And he asks, did you do anything to make sure that the dilution water was sterilized before adding it? One obvious advantage of a full boil is that you can be sure everything in the fermenter has been sterilized. Isn't dilution adding a risk of contamination?
Absolutely, 100%. That's why I chose to add the water right before cooling, so it had enough time to kind of sanitize. Now, I use RO water from the store. I believe that water is as clean as you can buy.
Yep.
Really, it's the vessel I'm putting it in, and maybe the providence of the machine I fill it with. Some people are like, "Whoa, that machine, it's outside all the time." I'm like, it's a public resource. I can't imagine it'd be that bad. It's clean consistently and all those things, right? So now people have RO systems at home. That would be like the best, right? That's like right there, boom. It's fresh. It's not sitting around it. It sits in a tap. Water sits chlorinated or chlorinated before it goes through RO, and then it hits RO, and then it's good. And that's like kind of by its nature sanitization, right? It's supposed to pull stuff out. Right now, the filter membranes could be a little gunky, but it's also supposed to remove the things that would hurt your wort. So in the end, I think it's the best. I think the safest way is to expose it to heat, but that's the thing is if you do it post-chill, pre-ferment, at least the oxygen isn't an issue. Then you go to post-ferment, and that's where I think other factors come into play. But I wasn't that worried.
Yeah. The whole post-ferment dilution thing, that might be fodder for another experiment in the future,
Absolutely.
actually. Absolutely. It would be interesting to do, this is getting me thinking about a lot of stuff. It'd be really interesting to do a post-ferment where you pre-boil the water to deoxygenate it, and then you just do, and we could do just store-bought, RO water. One of them boiled, the other one not. It'd be really interesting to see in a hazy IPA, right? If you do get oxidation or not. That'd be so interesting.
Yeah, and there's a couple ways of doing it, and not to give away all my tricks, but, think about all the ways we remove oxygen. You boil, there's Camden tablets.
Yep.
There's using CO2 to entrain oxygen out. I mean, we would be going all the way to remove the oxygen from the wort. So.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, that's going to be interesting. Another comment comes from Timbo, who says, I've been brewing this way for a while now after switching to all grain brew in a bag in my kitchen. When I switched to all grain, there was a huge difference in quality as I also started caring about my water profile. Good on you, Timbo. He says, this was the final detail that I was worried about as I carried the dilution habit over from my extract days. My beer always turned out well, so I wasn't going to invest in a bunch to change, but I am very glad to see this experiment and the results. I'll keep doing what works for me in my kitchen. I would be genuinely curious, though, to see if there was a difference in very hoppy beers. Would there be a perceptible difference in a 50 plus IBU beer that is diluted instead of full boil?
So that's where I really would like to go next. If I repeated this one, but with a different recipe, because I have to imagine so we have wort and we understand mashing and we understand OG, right? There's a lot of good data on that. It's going on for so long. On the other side of that, we have almost no data about diluting oils and all these little things and new hops, right? That's such a new aspect of brewing. I would have to think, again, we could be proven wrong, but I'd have to think, say you take this huge, heavily hop beer and then immediately add water to it, right? There is some saturation, right? And I think there's actually negative consequences to overhopping in wort versus doing just double or something. Like if you had to double it and then dilute it with water, I think there's negative consequence to that doubling rather than singling and then going for it. So I think there's something there, and I'm really curious about trying that by itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And final comment comes from Clark. It's kind of along the same line. He says, that's very interesting finding. I'd be curious how it would go with a much bigger grain bill if this is ever repeated. It's kind of the same thing. Higher hopping rates, more, a higher OG beer. Like what happens if you make an imperial stout and you split that wort and dilute one batch or one half of it or whatever it might be? I'm super curious as well. Can you get away with doing it in a higher OG beer in the first place. And because I think that's what a lot of people do, right? Is they can't fit the amount they need in their to make a 5-gallon batch of Imperial Stout in a Brewzilla, for example. And so they just make a higher OG 4-gallon batch because they can fit that, and then they dilute it down, post boil or even pre boil. Can you get away with doing that and make a good beer? I'd be curious to know as well, Clark.
Yeah, I think that's the next one where we go from it'd be kind of aggressive, but 1060 to 1.12. Yeah, that'd be another one to consider. It's possible, and again, there's a limit to all this, right? You couldn't dilute with. I can't imagine 80% dilute 80% water. There's got to be some impact at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's all we've got on diluting high OG wort to increase yield of a pale lager. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Andy?
No, I think this was a good experiment. I think it makes me confident to try more things, try post-fermentation de-aerate beer and then dilute there. But in the end, this is a great technique to make a beer that you target something, you have some recipe like, hey, what if we doubled it? What if we played all these rules together and put it out? I think you'd make 2 fantastic batches of the beer, and I bet you couldn't tell a difference, but go and try it.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to dilute your wort. I think it's a great method for people who want to increase the yield of their beer. Super cool, and it worked out in this experiment. So, well, don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where host Cade Job takes you into the lab with brewing experts to discuss the fascinating work that they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman.